Here. I'm Jane Marchant. Welcome to the fourth program of the She Opened the Door, Ask the Expert series, season 2. We're all very excited to start the second year of the program. As I said, I'm Jane Marchant, GS 15, SOA 18, and I'm a member of the She Opened the Door committee. And the Ask the Expert series features Columbia alumni speaking about their experiences, challenges, achievements, and everything else in an interactive setting with audiences around the globe. I'm pleased here to introduce today's speaker, Jennifer Allyn. Jennifer is a Columbia University alum 23 of the Climate School. She's currently the campaigns director of ClimateVoice after pivoting from a long career leading diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, most recently as a managing director at PwC. Near the end of today's program, we'll have audience Q&A, and you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit a question, and we'll try to get to as many as we have time to. So welcome, Jennifer. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you again for joining us at the She Opened the Door committee. It's exciting to delve into this chat about climate and your experiences and the kind of plethora of work that you've done. So first, I think we should start off with just some of your early experiences and your early influences so we can get a sense of who you were and how you came to be. So I'm wondering what made you choose to go to Brown and what influenced your decisions of study?
Well, first of all, Jane, I just want to thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah.
She Opened the Door is such a great organization, and what a great purpose and mission to elevate the voices of women and sort of how we're all trying to change the world. So I did go to Brown many years ago. It was a very exciting school to me, mainly because there was so much choice. So Brown is famous for not having any distribution requirements. And it's actually called the new curriculum, even though it was invented or launched in 1968, actually. So it's sort of the old new curriculum. And it was very appealing to me as a 18-year-old who really wanted to get out of the New Jersey suburbs to go to Providence, which to me seemed like a big city, and sort of study whatever I wanted. And in the course of all that choice, what I loved was Brown took students really seriously. Like, you had to choose your courses, and there was a lot of advisors to sort of help you. But, I took things in the wrong order. I took classes that were way above my head. I made lots of mistakes that were, really memorable and important. And in the end, I decided to study philosophy. And Brown had a philosophy concentration that focused on ethics and political philosophy in particular. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing to study. It was all the most important questions. So how do we live a good human life? And what is justice? And how can people solve our biggest problems sort of together? And looking at all the best thinkers who had grappled with those questions. And I was always surprised everybody didn't major in philosophy, but I guess some people were more practical about how it would actually affect their careers. I thought college was the perfect time to just really dig deep into the questions that, seemed the most interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious about when you said you made a lot of mistakes. I personally love a mistake. I learned so much from all of the mistakes I have made in my life. And I'm curious, what are some mistakes that you made when you were younger that you still think about now that you're grateful for?
I still think about my first career decisions right after Brown, and I sort of took a while to get my footing in terms of like my actual career. I worked for a group of different random nonprofits on, depending on the job market and where I was living. I worked for the Princeton Review, which was like the SAT prep company. And I remember being there and thinking, oh, this is not where I want to be. Like, this is not the best use of talent. But again, such a good experience. Like, it was the job that was in front of me. I think I really learned a lot about if you make a bad decision, you can change it. So the idea is about risk taking and radical acceptance of what's happening, really looking at where you are and saying, do I want to be here? If not, I'm the person in charge of changing it. So I agree with you. We learn a lot more from our mistakes often than our accomplishments.
Yeah, and life's a lot longer than I thought when I was younger. You can do so many different things, as you have done. So, so maybe you can walk us through what happened once you graduated, and then discarding maybe the Princeton Review, but how did you get to Catalyst, and how did you become into that position where you were really kind of doing very different work?
Yeah. So I had an amazing mentor, shout out to Ross Chait, who was my professor at Brown, who taught a class on ethics and public policy. And he had been doing a sabbatical at the Kennedy School at Harvard in public policy. And he really encouraged me to go there. So I worked again in all of these random jobs for a couple of years and then decided to go back to grad school. And I have a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School. And that was a really great 2-year experience to really think about how the big questions in philosophy sort of practically apply to the public sector, how change is made in government, both local, national, and international. Actually, it was a very international group of students. And so I love that work. And then when I graduated from there, I was like, okay, now it's time to find the career, right? Like what's the work that's the intersection of all of these things? And I was very lucky that I actually met somebody just through networking. Her name was Deborah. And she was working at Catalyst and was actually leaving and got me that first interview. And Catalyst was a really interesting organization. So it was founded the year before Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. So, that was sort of the book that launched the second wave of American feminism. And Felice Schwartz was this Vassar educated, super smart woman who had gotten married, gone to the suburbs, had some kids, and woke up one day and said, "Is this it?" And so she started Catalyst to help women get into the workforce. So Catalyst had like a library and they published books, and it was sort of like how to get your resume together and how to enter the workforce. And again, she was really ahead of her time in terms of women working outside the home was not as common a thing as it is now. But why Felice was so brilliant was that about, 15 years in the 80s, she said, women have done enough. The workplace is the thing that hasn't changed. And so she kept the mission of Catalyst, which was to advance women in business, but changed our clients to be the companies. So she gave away the library and said, we're not going to work with individual women. We're going to work with these CEOs and figure out how can they create a culture that will actually retain and advance this incredibly talented group of people who happen to be women. And how are they going to really deal with the question of motherhood and childbirth and breaks and sort of the fact that women's career paths were not as linear as men's. And so Felice was just amazing. And Sheila Wellington was the president of Catalyst when I was there. And we did some amazing work, both on the research side. So what were the obstacles that women faced in the workplace? And then on the consulting side, how could we really help these companies that wanted to do the right thing and who wanted to capitalize on the talent of the people they had, and they knew they had tons of women in the workplace. How could they really hold on to that talent and maximize it? And so I was at Catalyst actually for 7 years, and I feel like that was the moment where I really learned that my mission-driven desires. So I always thought I was always going to work for nonprofits, and Catalyst actually was a nonprofit because I wanted to save the world and be a do-gooder and all the rest. It was the first time that I saw that if you could have a company change something, you could really transform the culture because they had the money, the resources, the structure to really do something. So when we would do, a big assessment and say, you have to change your parental leave, and then they did it, and it affected thousands and thousands of people every single year, that was very, very satisfying. So I really did love Catalyst, and Catalyst still exists and is still going strong. And there's still a lot of inclusion and diversity questions that are hard in companies that haven't been solved. And so it was really a great learning experience.
I'm curious how some of the lessons that you've learned or some of the lessons that you brought to those CEOs and to those companies might be applicable to all of us in the audience or listening, or what we can, if there's any kind of tips or lessons or guidelines or posts that you could give to us to bring to our workplaces that might help that in conversation, or if there's any CEOs in the audience who might be able to get a tip to strengthen that female
Okay,
workforce.
for the
Yeah.
CEO in the audience. What we know about these big hierarchical corporations is that leadership has to start at the top. So we are in a moment where people are abandoning DEI. They are responding to sort of the backlash. And I think we all need to applaud the companies like Costco, interestingly enough, who are not running away from this, but leaning back into it and saying, this is part of our business strategy, this is part of our talent strategy, and we're going to keep it going. So I think it does take courage to speak out for these things. I think the thing about diversity is you're trying to create equal opportunity in an organization. So what you really have to be curious about is, what are the different experiences of people here who have different backgrounds? So, we used to do a big employee survey at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and when I was at Catalyst, PwC was my client, and that's how I jumped into working at PwC and sort of executing the strategy that we had done for the firm about how they could diversify the partnership. And we would do these big, big employee surveys, 50,000 people at a time. And I always said, you wanted people, when we would cut it by gender, by race, by age and generational diversity, we wanted people to sort of be equally happy or equally miserable. Like if people were unhappy about something, as long as everybody was unhappy about it, it was fine. What we were interested in diversity is, where was the gap? So what were the parts of the organization where men and women had really different experiences or different perspectives on whether it was working for them? And so I do think for CEOs in particular, and any executive leader, you have to be looking for the systemic change. And we tend to be so individualistic as Americans, also as people who want to, have our own destiny and make choices and feel like we're in charge of things. But it's the systems that you want to look at. So just one quick one. We had a system where we would rank people, right? You'd get grades at the end of each year that, worked on your bonus. And because it was a billable hours culture, the amount of time you put in a year really mattered. So everyone who had gone on a parental leave, and particularly the women who took longer time off, were disadvantaged in that system, right? And so you would sort of get docked on your rating, but not because your performance in the 8 months that you were there that year was bad. It's just you didn't have the full year to compete against your peers. And so my team was like, how do we change this? Because changing the whole, performance rating system for everyone was going to be impossible, because we were sort of talking about a group of like 500 people who we really wanted to be watching every year. But so what we said was, what if we gave an extra A to each practice for somebody who went on a parental leave, and just said, you don't have to dock someone else for it. You can have an extra one, because we know that her performance didn't go down. And what you're going to do is you're going to roll over her performance for the last year. And if her performance plummets and she says, oh, I'm going to get an A, so I'm not going to show up at work, then you can fail her. There's going to be a way to just get out of it. And it was such a good answer to this very particular problem in our culture. And I still have women partners who are like, because you also needed this A grade for like 3 years before you made partner. And they said it was the exact moment when I was having kids. It was the exact moment where my career and my life were intersecting and conflicting. And that one program, just that I didn't lose my rating, mattered so much.
That's really interesting. I also appreciate how you spoke about diversity as not just about race and ethnicity, but about gender and age and background and class and all these different things, because you do want as many different perspectives as possible looking at a problem. It just seems to strengthen your solution if you have multiple points looking at it. So I'm interested maybe for the audience for you to talk about how you pivoted to PwC, and then what exactly you were doing there, and what was your day-to-day and then kind of year-long goals as well.
Well, so as I said, PwC was my client when I was at Catalyst. So we did a big engagement with them where we interviewed a lot of people. We did a lot of analysis of their talent strategies and basically gave a lot of advice about what they should do to diversify the partnership in particular. So one of the things with professional services firms is there's a lot of diversity and equity in terms of half men and women, and a lot of racial diversity at the beginning of the ladder, right? When we hire people as associates. But as people sort of go up into that partnership ranks, that's when we lose talent and the numbers sort of become disproportionately male. Mm-hmm. So the question was, where are we losing people and why? And sort of what could we do along that continuum? And the thing about consulting is that it's very intellectually challenging. It's a great way to look at different problems across different industries and different organizations. But in the end, you sort of give this advice and you don't know if anyone's ever going to take it. So when PwC, we presented actually to the senior chair, his name is Dennis Nally, and he was the CEO at the time of the firm, and the management committee and the chief diversity officer invited me to come help her present these findings to them. And afterwards, he reached out to her and said, we should hire Jennifer to come execute the strategy. And it was such perfect timing for me, because that was the moment where I thought, oh, can I take my own advice? Like I've given this organization so much thought, like what would it mean to actually do it? And of course, the other thing about a partnership is, at the time that I was there were 3,000 partners, 50,000 people at PwC. So it was navigating this incredibly huge, decentralized, matrixed organization. And I had come from Catalyst, which was like 60 people, mostly women, very flexible, nonprofit. So it was the perfect time to sort of jump in and figure it all out. And I will say I stayed at PwC for 16 years because it's a great place. I had 4 different chairmen during that period, and all of them cared about diversity. We had a great team, like we were really resourced. We had a global team. We had people all over the United States. We had so many partners who cared about this work and really wanted to be at the cutting edge of it. And they really understood that it was about talent and people and making the firm the best it could be. So it was a very exciting time to be there. And we did, unconscious bias training with Dr. Mahzarin Banaji from Harvard. And she was fantastic to collaborate with. And we did it with everyone. And we created an on and off ramp for parents so that they could leave for a period of time, but stay connected to the firm. And then once they wanted to come back, they could on ramp back. And we did a lot of like really innovative, fun projects. And we did a lot of diversity conferences with our clients and talk to them about what their challenges were. And so it was just a very creative, generative time.
Yeah. And so if you were so happy there for 16 years, what were some of the catalysts of you leaving? And it was a pretty bold move to leave such a large and established firm to transition into another nonprofit space.
Well, some people,
Especially in climate advocacy, as a person can see the connections, but maybe you could speak about the connections as well of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that rolled over to your climate work.
yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of connections, but basically I started getting worried about climate like many people. And I feel like it was really a testament to journalism. I feel like journalists started reporting on climate around 2018, which is when the IPCC report came out, and the scientists who had been sort of very measured about the problem of climate change started really amping up their concern and worry and sort of ringing the alarm, if you will. And there were a lot of really interesting articles and books that came out during that period. And I remember vividly, I read David Wallace Wells, who was actually considered an alarmist at the time, but he wrote this beautiful article and then it turned it into a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. And the book is just, apocalyptic about like what happens if we go up by 4 degrees Celsius and sort of like all of the terrible tipping points that are going to happen. But the part of the book that I remember the most, other than it being like this big wake up call that like this was all potentially going to happen and unfold in this terrible way, was he said at the very end, we have all the tools we need to solve this problem. We don't have the political will. So we have renewable energy. We know how to decarbonize. We can do all of the solutions. If we do them at scale, we could actually get our arms around this in 10 years and really change the trajectory. But nobody's doing it. And why aren't enough people worried about it? And I remember feeling like that was such a wake-up call that if this is the most important issue of my time, like, why am I not putting my energy into solving it? And because climate brings up so many justice issues, and environmental justice and climate justice are such a big part of the movement and the way we've talked about the disproportionate impacts of pollution and global warming, there was a clear through line to me about how to do it. But I didn't feel like I could do it at PwC. So I didn't feel like I could sort of stay where I was and do it because, the firms aren't big emitters and they, it's really only the travel of their consultants. And so they're not on the cutting edge of it the way they were sort of on the cutting edge of diversity. So I actually decided to leave in January of 2020, which seemed genius until March. So I would say I did not have the forethought. And I'm, in retrospect, incredibly happy that I left because I would have never left during a pandemic. Like that would have been insane and would have felt crazy. So literally I had a party on a Monday where my boss, Maria Moats, shout out to her, who's an amazing leader, who just retired from the firm, gave me this big party. And so I had all these people and we were toasting about how great it was. And I was off to change the world of climate and solve this problem. And then that Friday, I went to DC and got arrested with Jane Fonda at one of her Fire Drill Fridays protests. So that had been on my bucket list. I love a good protest. And I'm
Getting
always
arrested was on your bucket list, or protest, or Jane Fonda, or all three?
all of it. All of it. It brought together all the best things. I had always wanted to be arrested, actually, yes, for civil disobedience, but I hadn't done it yet. So it was on my bucket list, but I'd been to a lot of protests. And what I love about Jane Fonda, other than she's just such an incredibly talented and committed human being who has, stuck to her values over the last 8 decades.
Yeah.
But she really uses her platform to highlight the people who are experts. So she was very inspired by Greta Thunberg, who was doing these, strikes at school and trying to get students who couldn't vote yet and couldn't really affect the climate crisis to actually do these school strikes to raise the alarm and to gather awareness and to get people mobilized. And she said, my generation, she's the baby boomers, needs to do the same thing and to support these students who are, Gen Z and younger. And so she started Fire Drill Fridays to say, the world's on fire and what are we doing about it? And she got a lot of her celebrity peers to come do these things. And she actually moved to DC and did a series of protests every Friday while she was off from filming the television show that she was doing with Lily Tomlin.
Oh my
And so
God,
this
that
was
should
the
be so
last
good.
one in January. And it was the last live one she did because of COVID after that, which we didn't know she was going to sort of pick it back up. But anyway, so I went with my friend Anne and we had so much fun. And so red is the big thing. So she had this amazing red hat and this red jacket, and I wore my red jacket. And because it was the last one of the year, or the beginning of the year, she had a lot of people there. So it was huge. And lots of Martin Sheen was there, and everybody was like, I wish you were my president. Like, it was really, really fun, but it was very organized. I mean, they were planning to be arrested, so it wasn't like a crazy, you certainly didn't get arrested by accident. You were doing it on purpose. You had a training, you knew exactly what was going to happen. There was no jail time. You had to pay a fine. The funniest thing about the fine was that you have to have $50. You have to have it in cash and exact change, to be ready. And then we were chatting with the woman who was taking our money, and she said, I just got Joaquin Phoenix's autograph. He just paid his $50 fine. So we were sad we missed him. But anyway, it was a career highlight for climate.
Yeah, I remember her red coat, and I remember something that was really powerful was listening to her talk about how she wasn't going to buy any new clothes from there on out, and thinking about the amount of waste that's in the fashion industry, and then in just our kind of general industry of you have to wear the newest outfit, you can't wear the same thing twice. And I remember that coat, right? Because she wore it.
Yeah.
She's like, this is the last coat I'm ever going to buy and wear. I don't know if she stuck to it, but I remember her saying that at the
I think
time.
she did. I mean, she's really, and what I also loved was at the rally before the action, she had all of these indigenous leaders who had stopped pipelines, and she had all these climate leaders from around the country. And she just introduced them. She was like, I'm using my platform and the fact that we have media here because of me, but I want the experts to talk about this issue and why it's so important that we're here and raising our voice together. And I was just very impressed by, again, how she used the influence and the voice that she had to point it in the right direction and to sort of manage the attention that she was going to get anyway.
It's a great example of what allyship is as
Yeah.
well. Yeah. So it sounds like you had considered and knew you were going into being arrested. It's interesting because I have so many overlaps with my kind of life and work. And at Columbia, I was in the Earth Institute, and I was, at the Lenfest Center for Sustainable Energy, and now I'm at Stanford's new sustainable school. And when I was at Columbia, I was also arrested for protesting, and it was unexpected. We were it was a surprise, and it was during a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, and it was a little bit surprising. And I remember running into the dean's office the next day because I stayed the night in jail at Central Booking, and being like, "Don't kick me out! Don't make me lose my scholarship! Like, I was arrested. Here's the paperwork." And she was like, go home, shower, go to bed. I'll write you a note to get out of your classes. It's not a big deal. And she said, we don't arrest or we don't punish students for protesting at Columbia, which is a little interesting now. But
Yeah.
thinking through other people who might be in a situation, like what kind of activism can arrest take? And then what advice would you maybe give to people who would love to go to a protest but are worried about arrest, or just thinking through something like that and the kind of negative repercussions that we see a lot in the news of what that could do?
Well, I think everyone has to, assess their own risk tolerance. So I wouldn't, tell anyone that they have to get arrested. I feel I have a group of friends where we've been to many protests together on different things. So for the last really 20 years, in terms of women's rights issues and reproductive justice issues, pro-immigration protests, gun violence, anti-gun violence protests in Washington, D.C. I have a friend who has a place in D.C. and she always welcomes protesters to come sleep on her floor so that we can go visit. And I find personally that being at a protest feels always very purposeful. And it always feels like this is where I should be. And that in some sense, particularly since our lives have become so digital and people are communicating across this digital void and feel like they're standing up for different things, when you go to an actual rally or protest, you're putting your body on the line and you're sort of showing up to be counted in this different, really embodied way that I find personally very satisfying and important. And of course, it's usually not that fun. It's always too cold and too hot. And, you have to go to the bathroom and you're standing around forever. And like, it's not about like the experience is fun. It's just that it feels like the right place to be if it's a cause that you truly believe in. And so I think people need to think about what those causes are. And obviously there's a lot of them. And so it's not like, you have to go to every one. But for me, shifting from diversity to climate too, I really wanted to be there, both because I thought Jane Fonda had done such an amazing job using her voice in this way. But I was trying to figure out, okay, so if I'm shifting this career late, or mid-career, let's say, in life, like how do I figure out how to frame these issues in ways that people can hear them? And again, I think one of the challenges with climate and that we really dug in at Columbia was that we have not successfully communicated both the scale and urgency of the problem to the number of people who need to be part of the solution. And that's a failure on us. And sort of how are we shifting that? And of course, now we're in a time of retrenchment and backlash. And so it's very demoralizing to figure out, what are those next steps?
And thinking about the individual person and all of us as individual citizens, and then the larger political leaders, it seems like all the power is in those political leaders, but we also have individual power that we need to take. But one question that you saw that I had kind of given you in pre-advancement, trying to think how I can best articulate it. But so much of our American culture is shaped by this decades of marketing and Madison Avenue advertisements, and this new thing will change your life and save your soul and make everything happy. And so we've kind of been ingrained to just purchase more and focus on this brand new and the kind of the best new car, the best new phone. And it seems to just be accelerating more and more. And we see things we know is just horrible, like that brand Shane, where you just get something and wear it once and toss it. But do you have any advice, or has ClimateVoice ever worked with marketing teams and with maybe nonprofit marketing firms or something where people are trying to work against that advertising and the American mindset that we've kind of conformed to, where we're also being told, no, actually wear the same thing, or we're marketed something different, to try and think about those differently and remove that idea of immediate gratification?
Yeah. So just quickly about ClimateVoice. So that's where I work now. And our mission is to really try to mobilize pro-climate companies to advocate for climate policy. So at ClimateVoice, our big belief is that the most systemic lever for change is policy, and that that's what's going to address the crisis at scale, and that big companies have a lot of power and voice that they can use to influence that. And when the good guy companies, the ones that really care about climate, don't use their voice, then the climate debates in the US in particular are dominated by fossil fuel interests. And that's why we don't have the climate policy we need. And we work to push these companies through their employees. So we're a big believer, our tagline at ClimateVoice is when employees speak, companies act, exclamation point, like that's what we're trying to do. So the campaigns that I'm running are really around educating and activating employees to ask these very questions that you're sort of saying. And we have one employee that used to work at Microsoft and Amazon. Her name is Maren Costa. And she actually is featured in a new documentary on Netflix called Buy Now, exclamation point, The Shopping Conspiracy. And she's one of many people talking about how online shopping has increased this sort of consumption-driven culture where we do throw things out, and fast fashion is obviously a huge part of it, but also the lack of friction in buying now, right? And the ease of delivery and the sort of all of the manipulative ways that these online consumer marketplaces get us to want more stuff that we don't need. And then how that contributes to, plastic pollution and whatnot. It's a really great film. It's a quick watch. It's very depressing. So, you have to sort of be ready for it. But she is an incredibly articulate person. And she was in charge of the algorithms that were trying to get people to buy more stuff. And she said, so purposeful in terms of not letting people opt out. Like you can't find out how to opt out of Amazon Prime. You can't get out of these sort of things. And that, the buy now button that's big and orange and, right there. We are wired for that kind of instant gratification. So I think consumerism is a huge problem and something that we can all make resolutions in terms of our personal commitments to stop. But again, to your question around, well, how do we really solve it? We would need a different circular system. We would need repair shops, on every corner so that you could take your goods and your, the sweater that you loved from 10 years ago and get it repaired. And like, how do we even create things with the circularity in mind? I mean, now we have planned obsolescence with our phones, right? It's not even like you can get it fixed if you want to keep your phone for a decade. So I think there are real systemic obstacles so that I wouldn't just blame individual choice. And that's why the most important action you can take if you care about climate is to vote for pro-climate candidates. So we need more political will. We need more policy, legislation, regulation, and elections are really the most important action that we should take. And there are lots of organizations like the League of Conservation Voters and others that rank politicians on their climate records. And state elections are really, really important now. So, there are a lot of states that are going to be leaders in climate action now that we're going to have this rollback and repeal at the federal level.
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me too of, we had an Ask the Expert series with Judge Kimberly Parker, maybe about a year ago from San Mateo. And she was also saying, one of the most important things you can do from her perspective was do jury duty and don't get out of it. So it's the same thing. You have to participate in all these levels of our communities, large and small. So then let me try and find some of our questions. We've jumped all over the place. And also, please feel free to the audience to add any questions that you might have into the chat, and we can get to them as well. So maybe how do you view equity and diversity and inclusion in relation to climate science and activism and global citizenship when we're thinking about being, American citizens in the sense of a citizen participating in their government, in their local community, being like a good citizen of in the non-legal sense. It's interesting saying that. And then how would we then move into a global mindset of that? And how do you view it in relation to the global community?
Yeah. Well, I think that the insight for environmental justice that is incredibly important is that the people who are the least responsible for global warming, for emissions, and for pollution tend to be the most highly impacted by the negative effects of those things. So that happens in our communities in terms of power plants being built in low-income communities where the pollution is, again, influencing those residents and not people who live far away from them. And it is also something when we look at like the global South versus the global North and the industrialized countries who have been responsible for emissions and global warming. And yet we have these island nations that aren't going to exist because of sea level rise. So that inequity is profound. It is immoral. And it is something that all of us should be working to address. I think that when you look at our international treaties and the COP process, the Conference of the Parties that happens every year, and sort of the UN negotiations, there's a lot of really robust and important discussions about loss and damage, and how are we going to create the financial resources for these countries that, again, are the most impacted and the least responsible to actually adapt to climate change, because it's here. And then what are the mitigation strategies that we're doing? I think that, a lot of the debate in the US is sort of like, well, our emissions have been going down and China is the problem. And yet when you look at legacy emissions, right, the US is the worst. So we have a lot of responsibility to take in global negotiations and then here at home to say that we have caused this problem. And at Climate Voice, we would argue that policy caused this problem. We have been subsidizing fossil fuels, right? We have been creating infrastructure like highways to encourage, car transportation over mass transportation. Like, we don't have good trains when you look at other countries that do. And those were all choices that have gotten us to where we are. And so I think the optimistic piece of all of this is we could make different choices. We could transform our world, right? We can change things in the future, and we can do that in a really, optimistic, proactive, abundant way. And yet, instead of that, we're fighting these old fights and we're acting like the status quo is just inevitable, because that's sort of the way it is, and we can't change things. And there was a big movement to deny climate science in the US. And what's interesting is that there's less climate denial now because it's just the evidence is so overwhelming. But instead, we have this trend of climate doomism. Like, well, it's just too late and you can't change it anyway. So live for today and don't worry about tomorrow, kind of thing. And I think that doomism and that deep-seated pessimism and resignation is also something that we all have to work really hard against. And that's part of why I went back to school, because I knew there was a lot of the science that I didn't know. So Climate Voice was founded by Bill Weil, who is this iconic sustainability leader. He had led sustainability at Facebook and before that at Google. And he started Climate Voice, again, to push these companies to do more, to use their voice for the transformative lever of change. And working with Bill was like an apprenticeship. It was amazing. I learned so much, but I also learned a lot about what I didn't know, which is why I went back to school at Columbia. And it was wonderful to be in rooms with, people like Kate Marvel, Dr. Kate Marvel, who's, this physicist and NASA scientist who really understands the climate models and like what the predictions are. And her message to everyone is, we have a choice. We've made choices up till now. We have a choice about the future. And what the climate models can't tell us right now is human behavior. Like, if we could change that variable, we could change it all. So I just want people to be more inspired. I think when climate comes up, they're like, oh, that's a depressing topic. I don't want to talk about that. And in fact, we have so much agency, both as individual consumers, as voters and citizens, as employees who are working for companies who have enormous power and lobbying voice with lawmakers. In all of those realms, we could make a difference.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because there's two, like it's a very another bold move to go back to school. I think that a lot of us are taught, you finish your undergrad and grad school and you're everything in your 20s and then you're done and you're not supposed to go backwards. You keep moving in this one career direction. So what was that choice like as a professional, as a woman? And how did you feel once you entered those classrooms? And also to join a new school, just for the audience, you were the second graduating class of the climate school at Columbia. So something to know too.
Well, I love that it was new. So I will say, as shout out to my daughter went to Barnard and she was the class of 2020. So I had heard about the climate school and Lee Bollinger's vision. And I thought it was so bold and exciting to bring together all these scholars across the university, to create a new school, to treat it like its own thing, like a law school or a business school, and to say that climate, again, is the existential issue of our time. And so we need everyone, like the best minds, working on it and thinking about it. And how can we train people to actually work in this domain? So I thought it was very, very exciting. I will say I expected to be the oldest member of my class, which I was, But I expected most of my classmates to be sort of between my daughter's age. I sort of thought like between 25 and 35. And I was shocked by how many of my classmates were younger than she was. About 20% of my class had come straight from college. So they were 22, 23 years old. So, one of the things we talk about diversity is that your identity when you're different is most salient when you're in the minority. So I had never really thought about my age that much until I went back to school, and I was like, wow, I really am a different generation. I'm gonna represent Gen X here for all the Gen Xers who are not in this room. Of Gen Z and millennials, and literally very few millennials. Like I was expecting more millennials. So anyway, it was, a great experience. I learned a lot. I wanted to know what these different generations thought about climate too, what was on their mind, how they thought about things. It was interesting that I didn't have to buy any books, which I also found very odd. I remember the bookstore in college and grad school and, trading in your used books and buying books, and everything was online and everything was a PDF. So that was really different. It was very exciting. I felt like my brain was really being stretched, like tired at the end of the day of thinking. And that felt satisfying. I will say it was more homework than I expected. It was a lot of homework. And I, was so impressed by the faculty and, took some classes that really blew my mind. And I'm a groupie of Professor Gerard. Michael Gerard at the law school has an amazing climate and public policy class that a bunch of us took. And we had a study group where we were all studying together for the exam because we were like, we've never taken a course where there's only one 4-hour exam and it's your entire grade. And,
My gosh.
that was a huge experience that we had together, which was fun. Yeah, I really loved it. And, a lot of my friends couldn't believe I was commuting from Brooklyn to Manhattanville. And I was really yearning for in-person connections by that point in the pandemic. And, I was over Zoom. And so very excited to have a commute and a destination and people to think deep thoughts with.
And then, well, I had a question and then it slipped my mind. I was like, wait.
No
Um,
worries.
yeah. It's just really interesting too to think about going back to school. But so when you were there, did you take a pause from ClimateVoice? Were you still working full time and going to school full time? What were the logistics of that like?
Yeah, so I decided to go part-time at ClimateVoice, but I did stay and I did work and I did full-time for school. So I finished it in a year, 1 calendar year, 3 semesters. I will say the hardest thing was finding space on campus to do my Zooms for work. So I became a huge fan of all the different library reservation systems to try to get, quiet space and a door so that I could do Zooms in between. But it worked out fine. And I had interviewed a bunch of people before I joined, which was great. The school was amazing about that because I wanted to meet people who had come back as mid-career students. I wanted to meet people who didn't have a background in science because that wasn't my background, and people who worked while they did the degree. And I did meet a couple people who worked full-time, which I think would have been very hard. And I wouldn't have been able to do that. But working a 60% schedule worked out fine.
How did you negotiate
You mean with ClimateVoice?
that?
I think
Just wondering for other people who might be interested in doing something similar.
yeah, I mean, from my work, they really understood why this was going to help enhance my contribution to ClimateVoice, right? Like this was going to open up networks and connections and information and ways of communicating things that was going to help the work at ClimateVoice. So Bill was very, very supportive. And he had been an MIT professor before going into corporations and climate. So I think he really valued that. So it wasn't a hard negotiation. I think the only thing was I was much more efficient with my time. And I will say now that I'm just back to working and not going to school, I'm like, boy, how did I do all that homework? And do it on time because boy, I feel like I have a lot more time on my hands, which is a good thing. Yeah, but it's also a great program because it's really 2 intense semesters and the summer is a little bit more flexible. So it goes by quickly, like all of life.
Yeah. So would you it's such a new program. Would you give any advice to others looking to begin a new program like this or to make a return to school after a developed career?
Yeah, well, I think you have to really look hard at yourself and it's not an executive education degree, right? It's a master's and it is very much designed, I feel like, for students who are right out of school or only a few years of work experience. So I think it's from the climate school's perspective, I know they're thinking about other degrees and expanding the options in terms of what they're doing. And I think if they wanted to create something for mid-careers, that'd be great in terms of really thinking through, how to make it more accessible to people who are also working. But I think for the audience, if there's something that have thought about and it suddenly gives you that exciting thing of like, ooh, what would I do this if I didn't have any obstacles? Like if I wasn't worried about being the oldest student or the time it was going to take, or, then I think that's when you want to take the leap. It was a very intuitive move for me. I mean, I did a lot of research, but, in the end, I was like, this is something I need a change. I also really wanted a climate community in New York, which I really have. So I will say, and a shout out to any of my classmates who are on this call who joined us. It was really an amazing class of 77 people and so warm and welcoming and really committed to making the world a better place. I was very impressed by the cohort and everything that we want to do. And people are in way different fields because, with climate, there's so much to do. There's so many things one could be doing. So,
And there's so many fields that are related that you might not think of, like battery storage or, deep sea mining or something.
yeah.
Um, there's a question from the audience too, and everyone please feel free to enter any questions from someone who's hesitant to change careers and they'd be looking at a pretty significant salary cut if they were to change into a job with skills and knowledge that would be different to what they had before. As the sole provider of my family, my salary is very important for our security. Do you have any advice for someone in my position who wants a career change but is nervous about changing jobs due to a possible salary cut? I could also see if you're changing careers, you might end up going into a lower position, but also thinking about going back to school. Um, if you're going on a salary cut, I'm imagining, I won't,
Yeah.
imply, but thinking like if you're going 60%, there will be financial repercussions. So if there's any advice or thoughts to that.
Yeah, well, so I have two thoughts on that. One is there's a lot of organizations now that are really trying to build up people's climate knowledge that don't have the time requirements of a full degree. So Terra.do is one of them, and they have like a 12-week boot camp called Learning for Action. That's everything you need to know about climate change. It's an online course. It's over 12 weeks. You can do the assignments, at your own pace and it sort of dips your toe into it in terms of that knowledge. Obviously, people can, there are other online platforms that do other things, but there's also something called the 1.5 Academy that's about training people about climate. And I just feel like the differentiation of those courses is really helpful, both to get more skills, more knowledge, more sort of like improve your baseline understanding of what are the dynamics in climate, and then what are some of the job questions and job opportunities out there. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I found was volunteering. So really volunteering for an organization that you believe in their mission, and then trying to figure out a way that you can help them with the skills and the experiences that you have in your current job, and do that over time to build that, to then do the transition. Because some of my best job transitions have been that, where I was working in something else, but then working with an organization or making that transition. And obviously the transition from Catalyst to PwC was very seamless that way. But I started volunteering at ClimateVoice before I got on staff. And again, that was just a great way to learn and to really figure out the ecosystem of all these nonprofit organizations. And particularly since I knew that I was coming in with less knowledge than I had in my much more senior position at PwC, I was ready for the pay cut. I had saved up and was able to do that. So I know not everyone can, but I think that is a real concern.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering too, from an equity standpoint and your work at PwC as well, Do you have any tips on maybe how someone might be able to negotiate for, rather than doing a salary cut, maintaining their similar salary, or just tips for going into those salary negotiations for someone, especially with an equity lens on it?
Well, it's funny. I used to teach a class at PwC about women in negotiation, and the most interesting finding, because everybody's always like, "Oh, do women and men negotiate differently?" And like, what are the studies say, and the rest of it. And the biggest finding was just that men negotiate more frequently than women. So it's not that one is better than the other, but that men tend to initiate negotiations 4 times more frequently than women do. So if you ask for things 4 times more than someone else, you're going to get more things. You're not going to get everything, but you're certainly going to get more. So I think the key to negotiation is figuring out, what do you have to offer in exchange? And then just ask a lot and keep asking and sort of stay persistent. I will say that a lot of very large organizations have sustainability teams who are under-resourced. So if you are at a big company or a corporation, figure out a way to help that group in terms of volunteering within your own company if you want to make that transition. So I know like there's green teams that employees have organized and sustainability initiatives, and those groups tend to need help. There's a big movement, every job's a climate job. So also trying to figure out what your current job is and how you can help your company make it more sustainable. And for that, I would also PwC has a lot of information about that. Deloitte has a lot of information about employees and sustainability. And then Project Drawdown has a piece of their work is called Drawdown Labs, where they talk about every job being a climate job. And then at ClimateVoice, if you go on our website, we have a climate action toolkit about how, if you're interested in climate and sustainability, you can start a green team in your organization, and sort of how to think about the policy issues and connect with the policy team and find out what stance your company has taken on policy and if you can encourage them from within to do more.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit too like making the role that you want happen at the job you're already in.
Yes.
Yeah. I
Then you
also
take a
really
pay cut.
and yes, but I also love the like if you don't ask, you're never gonna get it. And I do think
So true.
it seems like men ask for anything and they're just shameless about it, and women are. This is a very broad stereotype, but just where it feels like I've just been taught, don't ask, don't ask. That's rude. Like, how dare you think you can ask that? And I ask for everything now, and it's true. If you don't ask, you're not going to get it, and just ask politely, I guess. So there's a couple questions here in the chat. Let me see if I can read this out to you. I'm curious, since ClimateVoice focuses on the policy aspect and that you highlighted the importance of voting in elections. We've seen in this election particularly the critical role individuals from private companies play in shaping elections and policy priorities. This question might be a bit of a stretch, but is there any work being done regarding reverses Citizens United versus FEC? Or I'm curious about your thoughts regarding limiting private influence, often with non-climate focused interests, from shaping policies that tend to get us further away from achieving climate justice.
That is a big and very deep question. Our argument to employees is your company is lobbying all the time, and we want them to lobby for climate. So we want you as one of their key constituents to sort of raise up this issue that you care about climate, you care about sustainability, and you want your company to do the right thing. And part of this model was actually something Bill and I both experienced at our companies before, which is that LGBT employees pushed organizations to speak up for marriage equality. So like PwC and Facebook and Google had these great same-sex partner benefits. We had all sorts of affinity groups for LGBT employees, but our folks came to us and said, we want you to take a stand on marriage equality because that's the policy issue of this day, and you can have a voice in that. And there were hundreds of companies across the US that weighed into this issue by publishing op-eds, by signing amicus briefs, by really encouraging lawmakers to change the laws on that topic. And so we want to do the same for climate. So we sort of accept that lobbying and corporate influence on lawmakers is the baseline of where we are now. And because we don't have a lot of time, we've got to use the system we have for the issues that we care about. And because the big tech companies in particular are really pro-climate in terms of they have ambitious targets, they buy a lot of renewable energy, they understand and believe in climate change, they know that it's a material issue for their business. Those are the groups that we're trying to sort of influence and have unlock their influence for the climate crisis. We do get the pushback from some employees. Shouldn't we all be lobbying less? And I think that's a very legitimate question. But in the moment that we're in, with the system that we have, the question is, can we democratize and diversify the lobbying, both have more individuals be able to lobby? And there's a great organization called the Good Lobby, actually out of Europe, that tries to do citizen lobbying and sort of talk about that. But also to have these companies just lobby more transparently, right? So we definitely want transparency in terms of we should know, it should be on the record what you're lobbying for and the money that you're spending. We've seen these tech companies be extremely transactional in the last couple of months in terms of the
24 hours.
Right. The last, is it a week, 2 weeks? How long has it been? And so the question is, can we sort of shift them to use that for something that they're already on the record as caring about doing? But I do think that other question about like the system itself and how do we reform and transform that is huge. I'm just not involved with that. And then the other thing is that Climate Voice is a 501c3, so we don't lobby directly. We're just educating folks about it. And then the last thing I just want to say about Climate Voice is we've really been trying to educate employees about the obstructionist role of trade associations like the US Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, where all these great companies who are pro-climate are part of these institutions and organizations that are actively lobbying against climate. And that disconnect and hypocrisy we really saw in the last administration, where a company would take credit of like, yes, we believe in climate disclosures and support the SEC in what they're trying to do, and then the US Chamber of Commerce is suing them to stop any of those regulations going into effect.
It's interesting. I've thought about being a global citizen and a community citizen, and I've never necessarily thought of being like a worker citizen or a citizen at my job. And when I was at Columbia, and I'm sure all of us were involved in so many different groups, and I was in like the outdoor club and this, and on the Earth Institute Student Advisory Council, but we don't kind of take that same mentality when we go to work. So it seems like a lot of us could probably form these groups and do like mini climate unions, at work to advocate for certain things. One question that just popped into my mind, which I don't think we've ever asked something like this at She Opened the Door, but there's so many questions about transitioning careers. Is Climate Voice hiring? Would you, or other places? One person asked in the chat that they're curious about volunteering opportunities in New York. Does Climate Voice have opportunities, or are there other organizations that you could navigate people to?
Definitely reach out to me. We would love volunteers. We are a very small and scrappy team, so we are not hiring at the moment. But we have a lot of really active volunteers at Climate Voice, and I would love anyone who's interested. My email is jennifer@climatevoice.org. Super easy to remember. And yes, I think that organizing in your own company is a great way to start. And again, we frame it as you're going to be a climate advocate, not an activist. You're not against the company. You're sort of saying, I'm proud to work here because you have sustainability goals and you care about climate and you've written these great reports about what we're going to do in this space. And now I want us to use our collective voice, right? I want to unlock your influence as my company to really advocate on these issues. And I think right now, it's going to be a lot of defending the progress that we made in the last 4 years in terms of legislative priorities around clean energy. And so we need companies to speak up for those things.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I wish we had another hour to chat, but our our time is up. So if anyone has further questions as well, both my and Jennifer's LinkedIn's are in the chat there. And then maybe we can have Jennifer's email typed in really quick to the chat too. I think it was jennifer@climatevoice.org.
Sure. I'll put it in. I haven't looked at the chat at all. Sorry, Jane.
No, you're not required to by any means. So I'll just say thank you so much, Jennifer, for spending the time with us and for sharing all of these really wonderful insights into your career in the climate and what we can do. I'd also really love to thank the She Opened the Door Committee and the CAA for helping make this possible. There's so many people behind the scenes who do a lot of work, so thank you all to everyone. For those in the audience, I hope you consider joining us. The CAA is also always looking for volunteers, a fellow alumni and students, the She Opened the Door Committee as well. We're always happy to hear from you all. Our next She Opened the Door Ask the Expert series will be Friday, April 25th at 12 p.m. So you can sign up, tell your friends, it's open to everyone. And finally, as I said, if you want to connect with us, you have our LinkedIn there. So thank you all very much for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon or evening or morning wherever you are. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, bye everyone.